For more on the health of the global economy, let's bring in William Lee. He's chief economist at the Milken Institute, and thanks so much for joining us. William, dive into these numbers for us, the OECD. It has this rather dire outlook. What jumps out at you?
Well, I'm most impressed by the fact that they think the U.S. recession will be a shallow one. It looks like it's going to be in the first half of the year. We'll have 2 quarters of negative growth, but it looks like we'll pull out of it in the second half of the year. And the unemployment effects are very, very minor compared to traditional recessions, whereas Europe is being hit by a huge amount of supply shocks and energy shocks. And they, as you said, will be bearing the brunt of the global slowdown.
And will inflation show any signs of slowing down, do you think?
Well, that's the problem. When you have a very mild recession in the U.S., it's very unlikely that the recession is strong enough to pull down spending and contain the amount of inflation that we've got. We've got well over 6-7% inflation, and it looks like it's coming down, but it's coming down at a very slow pace. In Europe, you have a really difficult problem where oil prices continue to be very high, and their energy shortage is making their inflation even more difficult to deal with, because cutting back on demand will worsen the unemployment rate so much that the price for lowering inflation is going to be too high for the authorities there, and that's a real dilemma for them.
Yeah, it's a real juggling act, isn't it? What can the central banks do to adjust their forecasts?
Well, I think the best thing that we can do is that the central banks have to cause people to believe that they're serious about containing inflation. Because if they're serious, that means that they will raise rates to whatever it takes to get the inflation to come back to the 2% target. And if people are afraid that they're going to be laid off, then people are going to stop spending. But right now, I think people are thinking, my God, unemployment rate is only 3.5% here in the U.S. It may even go to 4.5%. But it's not me that's going to lose my job. It's the other guy. And as long as people think it's the other guy that's going to lose their job, they're going to keep spending. And the inflationary policy, anti-inflationary policies of the central banks have got to be stronger than what's needed.
And William, you see here in the U.S. the Fed being rather hawkish in an attempt to tame inflation, to create a soft landing. Some are saying that these efforts are already damaging the economy. What's your take on the policy, and how does it dovetail with these projections that we're seeing from the OECD, do you think?
Well, the OECD is taking the Fed at its word that they'll take whatever measures are needed. And you already see the effects on the housing sector in the U.S. You're starting to see some consumers start to cut back on their spending, because the U.S. Is really a bimodal economy. You have a lot of poor people who are living hand to mouth, paycheck to paycheck, and you have the rich who seem to have a huge amount of savings, and they can finance their spending out of savings. And that bimodal economy is much more prominent here in the U.S. than it is in the rest of the world. And it makes the U.S. Federal Reserve job even more difficult, because you can't target one policy for 2 objectives.
And it looks like, if you look at these numbers, they're rather bullish when it comes to India, China, very bearish when it comes to the U.K. Can you talk to us about why that's the case?
Mike, that's a great point. Right now, there are different parts of the world that are handling the supply shocks differently. India is a great example where they're essentially violating sanctions, and they're trading with Russia, and they're able to keep their economy going by doing these less than politically desirable strategies. China has really done a tremendous job of trying to contain the COVID, but at the same time, the economy has slowed down to the point where the authorities have taken serious measures. The central bank has lowered interest rates. The municipal governments are trying to resolve the difficulties in the property markets. And China is trying to bootstrap itself back up to a strong growing economy again. So we have differences in policies because each of these economies are faced with different circumstances.
William, in the past we've talked to you about COVID and supply chains and all these different issues. What do you see as the biggest financial risks out there right now when it comes to a global recovery?
Mike, as central banks start to raise interest rates, the one thing that's affecting all global markets is the lack of liquidity. You're starting to see financial markets become much more volatile. Asset prices are jumping up and down much more than they normally would be. And that's a sign that the shrinkage of central bank balance sheets and the raising of rates is having a double whammy. And the lack of liquidity, which is a technical jargon to say, asset prices are getting volatile and stock prices moving up and down a lot more than they used to. That causes something that what the central banks and regulators worry about: systemic risk. If the financial system is threatened and the stability of the financial system is threatened, that will be yet another nightmare that the authorities will have to deal with.
And one of those nightmares out there when we come to talk about geopolitics, of course, what's happening, the crisis in Ukraine, how is that factoring into what we're seeing right now? Because there's been so much talk about energy and how that's having a ripple effect on other countries.
Normally, central banks have to worry about inflation, unemployment, and maybe keeping the financial markets intact while they're raising rates. Now you've got this triple whammy of geopolitical tensions and geopolitics, where different parts of the world, especially in Europe, are suffering much more so than other parts of the world, and the policies have to be modified accordingly. Emerging markets are certainly the ones that are suffering the most because they're not only getting high energy prices, but they're also suffering from food insecurity, and a lot of people are starving out there because of this war.
William, always great to get your insights. Thanks so much for taking time with us this evening.
Thanks for having me.